Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is joining us today for our webinar, Why Leather? The Genuine Facts. My name is Steve Jeske, Vice President of Marketing for GST Seton Auto Leather, and I will be the monitor for today's event. And today we are extremely pleased to have three esteemed industry executives joining us. First of all, Steve Sothmann, who is the President of the Leather Hide Council of America. Secondly, Dietrich Tegtmeyer, our Vice President of Innovation for Lanxess. And finally, Egbert Dikkers, the Global Director of Sustainability, Smit and Zoon, as well as the Chairman of the Managing Board of Leather Naturally. Now, a little bit of administration information first before we get into the webinar itself. Along the Zoom webinar toolbar, please note there is a Q&A button. And as we go through today's presentations, please submit questions during the webinar, and we will plan to have a Q&A session upon completion of the three presentations. So without further ado, Steve Sothmann will be our first speaker, and we'll be discussing today our ethical duty to use leather. Take it away, Steve.
All right, well, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the introduction and inviting me here today to talk to you all about one of my favorite topics, which is leather. My message is pretty simple, to be honest, today. That is, we as a society actually have an ethical duty to be using leather as a material for a number of different reasons, which I'll get into. And unfortunately, we are not meeting that ethical duty at this point. So simple message, but we'll do some deep diving into that topic. Couple main points. These are the things to remember. Hopefully you'll come away with these. Leather is a byproduct of food production. That's an extremely important point to remember, and one that we'll do a very deep dive of. As a society, in order to be sustainable, in order to be ethical, we should be using this material as the byproduct of another industry. And unfortunately, again, we are not doing that right now as a society, and we need to be doing better. So let me tell you just really quickly a little about me and my organization. I'm president of the Leather and Hide Council of America. So we're an industry trade association that represents companies in the supply chain from the meat packing side up to hides and skins processors, leather tanners, chemical companies, manufacturing, everybody in the supply chain from when the hide it drops off from the animal. We recently went through a merger, so we have a new organization name as of January of 2020, but our predecessor organizations go all the way back to 1919, and we are the major representative for this industry in the U.S. and abroad. So let's jump in. Leather is a byproduct of food production. Let's talk about that. And let's start with the very, very basics. Why do we eat beef? Why do we eat these animal proteins? Well, and this might be very simple, it might be intuitive to a lot of people, but it's a point worth remembering and talking about. We eat meat because ruminants, cows especially, and I'll focus on cattle and beef industry here, but cows have stomachs to eat plants that we do not as humans. They are nature's first upcycler and a natural upcycler that can take these plant products that we as humans cannot consume. They turn them into a protein that we can consume and use for our benefit. So cattle spend 90% of their life, at least in the U.S., on grass or eating foraged plants leftovers. So either on open plain grass, or also you can send cattle into fields after you've harvested other crops and actually let them clean up what's left over in terms of forage material. In the U.S., we do finish a lot of our beef animals on grain. So about 10% of their overall diet will actually be grain. And the reason we do this is because it's a further productivity conversion rate. So for about a pound of feed that's fed to an animal, at the end of its production, you'll get about 1.19 pounds of beef out of that. So that's why the industry has been doing it. And it's been a cycle that's been working for us for a very long time. Beef is a nutrient-dense, nutrient-rich food. You get a lot of nutrients, a lot of proteins, a lot of mineral content from beef that you cannot necessarily get from other food sources, especially a plant-only diet. So some things to remember: we've had ruminants for thousands, if not millions of years on our planet doing exactly this, taking plant material, turning it into different animal proteins, and then we've consumed those proteins. So if you look back to the 1500s, for example, there was an estimated 60 million head of bison roaming North America doing exactly this process. So this is something that's been around for forever. So let's just talk about the typical life cycle of a U.S. beef animal. Again, they're spending the vast majority of their life eating plants that we as humans cannot eat. So they'll start their life out on a cow-calf ranch. This is where they are birthed and first brought into the world. They spend about 6 to 10 months on those ranches. Then they might move on to another type of ranch called a stocker or a backgrounder. Again, this is a business whose business plan just basically puts these animals on other types of plant forage, grasses to eat, and they'll be there for another 2 to 6 months of their life. And then finally, I mentioned we do finish out our animals in the U.S. In a feedlot system, and this is where we'll be finishing them on either grain or they could be further supplemented with grass as well. And they'll only spend about 4 to 6 months of their life at that finishing stage before we process them for food. So vast majority of their life is on grass, doing what ruminants do. So I just included a couple pictures here. I think a lot of people might have already fundamentally know what this looks like, but depending on where you grew up or where you're from, you may or may not. The picture on the left is what a cow-calf ranch or a stocker backgrounder ranch would look like. So this is just open, grassy field. Cattle out, willing to, or able to do what they want to do, exhibit natural behaviors, and be happy cows out in the field. So anywhere from 8 to 16 months of an animal's life is spent on a field looking like that. Now, on the right, I included some pictures of the feedlot system, because if you haven't seen a feedlot before, I think some people might think it's some sort of confined feeding system, or where the animals can't roam and exhibit natural behaviors. That's just not the case. It is a field that is a little bit smaller, so that the animals are a little bit closer together, but that's because they want to be more closely monitored towards the end of, or while they're putting on this weight with the grain being fed. So these animals are not force fed by any means. Grain is extremely tasty to these animals, and you don't have to force them to want to eat it. So again, they are able to exhibit any natural behavior they would like in this atmosphere, and they're also very closely monitored. So let's talk about greenhouse gases. We can't talk about cattle and beef industry these days without talking about greenhouse gases. It's been widely discussed in the popular media. I'm sure you have heard plenty and seen plenty of articles about this issue. The problem is it's one of the most grossly misunderstood and cherry-picked and warped discussions that out there today. And so it's really important to put this all in context overall. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner of this slide, this is a graphic that's produced by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, our government agency that oversees greenhouse gas emissions and other issues. And if you look at the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., you're going to look at transportation is 28% of our emissions, electricity is 28% of our emissions, industry is 22%, and agriculture is 9% of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. This is one of those areas, again, that gets cherry-picked. The data is warped, so you might not realize how small the agricultural footprint actually is. Now, within that 9% of greenhouse gas emissions, that is all agriculture. So if you pick out only animal agriculture, that drops it down to about 4% of overall greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And if you take out just the cattle production side of it, you're only talking about 2% of direct greenhouse gases emitting in the U.S. That is direct emissions. It does not include things like the transportation involved in the process or other life cycle assessments. So if you do that, that analysis, the number for cattle goes up to about 3.8 or 3.9% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And what's really important to understand too is the gases that are being emitted in this process. So when we're talking about cattle production and greenhouse gases, we're usually talking about methane emissions. So methane is a natural gas that the animals emit after consuming the plant matter that we discussed earlier, and they emit it primarily through belching. And you might have seen that methane gas is one of the worst greenhouse gas emission, warming gases that we can produce as humans. But the thing that's really never discussed and a topic that has been grossly misunderstood is that methane emission is very different than carbon dioxide emission. So methane will actually break down in the atmosphere after about 10 years. It turns into carbon, it turns into other gases, and then it gets recycled back into the biogenic carbon cycle. So it's turned back into other grasses. It's used in the photosynthetic process by plants. And so it's part of this natural cycle, and I'm looking mainly at to the right side here, this natural cycle that's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, this is very, very different than fossil fuel or carbon dioxide emission from fossil fuels, where there is only it's not a cycle, it's a one-way street. You're taking those fossil fuels out of the ground, you're using them for transportation or electricity or what have you, sending them into the atmosphere, and then there's no way for those gases to be reabsorbed back into our planet. So this is one of those areas where it's agriculture, and especially animal agriculture and the cattle and beef production get very much maligned in the popular media because we're only looking at one side of the equation. We're only looking at the emissions side. We never are looking at the other side of the equation where those animals are actually helping in the carbon sink growth. So they're, by eating those grasses, those grasses are then regenerating later and reabsorbing a lot of those gases back into their soil. So this is an area that hopefully some of the popular discussion is beginning to turn on a little bit, and we're hoping that that'll continue and people will start to see that there's a big difference between the types of emissions we're talking about here. Now, one final point on this I'll just make. I'm looking at the lower left-hand corner of my slide here. The U.S. Department of Agriculture a couple of years ago did a kind of a thought study piece, research piece on what would happen to the greenhouse gas emissions for the United States if we went to a 100% vegan diet. So if all of animal agriculture was removed from the formula and we only produced plant-based products. Well, our greenhouse gas emissions would reduce by about 2.6% overall. But that's obviously not the full 3.9% or 4% number I was telling you about earlier. And that's because there's other factors that are now in play. So first, you have to find fertilizer somewhere. So now you have to be using synthetic fertilizers, which increases our greenhouse gas emissions. You'd also have some soil erosion issues because you wouldn't have the ruminants churning up the soil and working that soil. But the big one is they found that we would likely have insufficient nutrients to feed the U.S. population. So as you may or may not know, the U.S. is a net exporter of agricultural goods. We feed not only our own population, but the world as well. And if we were to move to a 100% vegan diet production system, we would not be meeting our own nutrient requirements. So one thing that's important to note too, since methane is only living in the atmosphere for about 10 years before it breaks down and is reabsorbed, that means that as long as the population of cattle in the United States stays constant or decreases, then that means that we will have there will be no new additional greenhouse gases added into the atmosphere. And so what I'm really happy to report is we've actually been doing quite a lot as an industry to bring our total number of animals down, and our herd is getting smaller. So in 1977, the U.S. had about 122 million head of cattle. As in 2019, we were down to 95 million head, and we're still producing the exact same amount of beef overall in 2019 as we were in 1977. So we've made a lot of efficiencies gains in the U.S. We're much more productive than we used to be, and that's how we're able to reduce those numbers and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we did that through a number of different ways. Animal welfare practices got quite a bit better. Our animal nutrition understanding got a lot better. And then animal genetics. There's been a lot of research in animal genetics, and believe it or not, cattle semen is one of the most expensive items you can buy on the market because it can be really valuable from this perspective. I'll pause here just for a second. So I've been talking about U.S. cattle production. I'll just now relate that to global cattle production. If you're looking at the total number of cattle in the world, we're talking about there's about 1 billion head of cattle, give or take, somewhere between 950 million and 1 billion head. And we process about 240, 250 million head each year for beef production. Obviously, those numbers are estimated in some parts of the world and in a lot of developing regions, but we have a pretty good idea of the number of animals in kind of the developed beef producing societies in the world. So those numbers, again, pretty static. So taking it all, not adding any new greenhouse gases to the atmosphere as long as those numbers stay about the same. Now, the other thing we can't talk about, or we have to talk about if we're going to talk about cattle and beef production, is obviously animal welfare. This is a huge issue for the industry. It's something that the industry spent a lot of money and resources on investing in. So just let me give you some animal welfare 101 information. In the U.S., we have a robust legal and regulatory system surrounding how our animals are treated. So a lot of people think that there is no government oversight of how an animal is treated by the industry. That's just not the case. For example, if in processing plants and meat packing plants, there are USDA government inspectors, government paid employees, inspectors in every single plant when they're operating at all times. These plants are not allowed to operate unless the U.S. Department of Agriculture inspectors are there and present. And those inspectors, if they see some sort of animal welfare violation, do have the power to shut the plant down and make sure that those animals are treated correctly. So, our legal framework is very high to begin with in the U.S. Now, on top of that, of course, there are additional best practices and industry certification programs that have been implemented all up and down the supply chain. I've included a picture here of Temple Grandin, Dr. Temple Grandin. So she's kind of the matriarch or the godmother of our animal welfare programs in the United States. She is a fantastic person, has a fantastic story on her own, and they made a movie about her where Claire Danes played her, so I highly recommend seeing that and checking her out. But she's really set the groundwork for a really robust welfare system in the U.S. So everything from on-farm and feedlot, transportation, and especially in the packing plant level, there are certification programs discussing, overseeing the welfare of these animals. Now, one thing that we haven't done, I think, as a leather industry is translated those programs forward to our leather customers. So that's definitely something as an industry we need to be doing a better job of, and something we'll be looking forward to working on in the future. So just real quick recap. We consume beef, we consume dairy because we need it. These are nutritional requirements that the human population needs globally. As sustainable industries, we also have a duty not to be wasteful. And so we must be using every one of the products that we're developing as part of this food system, and especially when it comes to leather. So we'll be kind of diving into that a little bit here. Leather is a byproduct of that food system. Now, sometimes certain groups, especially anti-animal agriculture groups, like to say, if you boycott leather, you're going to somehow save the animals. And that's just not the case. We are not producing these animals for leather because leather is a byproduct. So here's the proof. On the left, what I've pulled here is a U.S. Department of Agriculture report. This is called the byproduct report, or the drop credit value report. This is something they publish every single day. I pulled it from Thursday, May 28th. Basically, what this is showing is the value of all products that are coming from a cow on that day in the United States that's not meat. And so if you add all these products up, it's about 6.8% of the value of the animal on May 28th was non-meat products, so basically the byproducts. Now, the cattle hide is typically the most expensive or the most valuable part of the drop credit, but when you break it out of the overall system and you look at it, on this day in May, it was only 1.2% of the value of the entire animal. So the point of this is to show that there's not a single cattle producer, a single rancher, a single farmer in the U.S. and probably the world that is making a decision of whether to produce more or less animals based on the value of a hide alone. So this is a pure byproduct of food production. And this graph just kind of is saying the same thing, or showing the same thing I did in that previous slide, but just on a historical perspective. Historically, if you look at an average, 2014 through 2018, this red line, the byproduct values were somewhere between 12% and 13% of the value of the animal. In recent years, we've seen a significant drop in the overall value of those byproducts, and that has been driven almost entirely by the value of a hide dropping. We are unfortunately seeing extremely low and record low values for these hides. So hopefully you all know this, but if you don't, one of the reasons why we're seeing such low prices for these cattle hides is because the market share for leather has been taken by synthetic alternatives, largely plastic, and it's replaced leather in a lot of its traditional markets. And since leather's a byproduct of another industry, we can't turn off the supply necessarily just because we're losing market share. So what that's led to is a situation where we have an abundance of hides and nowhere to put them. So we're basically being extremely wasteful and not very sustainable from this perspective. So this is the final slide I'll leave you with, and this is the sad reality of where we are at this time. In 2019, we processed about 33 million head of cattle for food in the U.S. And so that means we produced about 33 million hides. Based on a number of data points that our association collected, we think about 27.5 million of those hides ended up in the leather supply chain, whether that's domestically or globally, leaving about 5.5 million hides that did not make it into leather. So that's about 17% of our overall numbers produced last year. So where do those hides go? Unfortunately, the vast majority of them probably ended up in a landfill. There's just not a lot of other uses for a hide. Sometimes you can break them down into their base proteins and use them in gelatin or collagen production, but unfortunately the hide's not a very good product for that. So the vast majority of those hides ended up in the landfill. And unfortunately, it was very small producers, small packers that end up having to compost these hides. It's typically not the bigger companies that you might be familiar with. So it's compounding the problems for those companies. So those 5.5 million hides, they could have been 99 million pairs of shoes. They could have been 110 million footballs, 2 million sofas, any number of products that have now incorporated plastic synthetics instead. And so it's ended up with us being extremely wasteful. So I hate to leave you on that unfortunate note, but happy to stop there, take questions, and thanks for listening to me today. I really appreciate it.
Steve, thank you so much for that great overview of why the cattle and beef industry is so important to mankind and why we, as the leather industry, are able to utilize the hides in a wonderful upcycling method. Now, our second featured guest today is Dietrich Tegtmeyer, and he is going to present Chemistry Solutions, Leather versus Synthetics. Dietrich, take it away.
My name is Dietrich Tegtmeyer, and I'm working since more than 20 years in the leather industry as chemist for Lanxess, mainly in the field of product development and application. I got asked to provide some insights about the chemicals used and the process of leather, particularly in comparison to synthetic materials. The main difference, of course, is that leather mainly consists out of collagen, a natural and biodegradable raw material source. However, based on weight, up to 40% of the leather even are incorporated or attached chemicals. So chemistry is an important factor in the leather making process. Without chemicals, no leather, we can say. The role of chemicals is varying. We have the process chemicals, which prepare and turn the hide into the durable material leather. This chemical reaction is called tanning. Then we have the incorporated chemicals, providing the character of the leather, such as softness, color, or filling. Third, chemicals are generating even additional value for leather, for example, in upgrading poor raw material qualities or increasing the cutting yield. And finally, attached chemicals guarantee the physical performance of the leather surface, like, for example, the light fastness, abrasion, or anti-soiling properties. So chemicals are playing an important role, but do chemicals make the article less sustainable, or are they even in contradiction to the natural material leather? Let me give you some further insights. Since about 20 years, the chemical industry has focused on a sustainable development process and nearly completely exchanged their product portfolio according to latest updates in science. Benign by design was always our principle, to make chemicals as natural as possible, as well as to make them as harmless as possible. As a result, not only the leather base itself, even most chemicals we use for today's leather making either do have a natural origin, like enzymes, proteins, casein waxes, or starch, or are purely natural extracts, such as vegetable tannins, cellulose, lignin, or even just harmless inorganic natural minerals, such as talcum, zeolite, or chrome sulfate. So, coming back to the question from before, I think it is fair to answer with a clear no. Chemicals are not in contradiction to a sustainable leather solution, but the other way around, the right choice of chemicals can be the solution. Next, I want to talk about the process of leather making, evaluate the most critical process parameters. Here, unfortunately, a lot of misleading information and wrong perceptions are circling around in public media, while the truth about today's leather industry is very much different. Let me explain further. First parameter I want to talk about is water, the water consumption, an extremely important topic. Yes, water is required in the leather making process because leather is produced in big drums in a process similar to a washing machine. If you Google the water footprint for leather, for example, from the NGO waterfootprint.org, there is an astronomical number of water use communicated. It says 17,000 liters of water are required to produce only 1 square meter of leather. Is this fair to state? On one hand, yes, because the number is calculated on an accurate allocation method, but on the other hand, a clear no, because it is completely misleading without some further explanation and not the right base for any benchmark study. Why? I can tell you. 99% of these 17,000 liters of water are coming from the farming industry and are not allocated to the true leather making process. And out of these 99%, more than 90% is just rain or surface water to grow plants the animal is going to eat. This growth of plants, called photosynthesis, happens anyway, regardless if an animal is raised or not, and regardless if a leather is produced out of the hide or not. Actually, this photosynthesis is even a carbon sink, as mentioned in Stephen's presentation earlier before. That is why I said this huge water footprint of 17,000 liters water is misleading and not fair, to punish the article leather. The true amount of water required in the tannery varies only between 100 and 250 liters per square meter leather, depending on how much water-saving technologies a tanner has implemented. This again is not a questionable benchmark. I mean, the amount of water a tanner is using, because technical efforts to minimize water usage, of course, can cost additional money, and are not always necessary to do so. Let me explain. A tannery usually operates in a bypass to a river or any other water stream as indicated in this picture. No water actually is consumed. All water is taken and released back again. If a tannery operates in a region with enough natural water reservoirs, there is no environmental justification to spend cost and energy to minimize the water used for the process. The important environmental factor now is that the water is treated properly before getting released back into the river. And here we can say in a modern tannery, there is always an efficient wastewater treatment plant in place, which cleans up the discharge effluent, sometimes even to a level of cleanness which is better than the water quality which was taken out of the river before. Therefore, I believe from a responsible production point of view, this topic water is fully okay. Leather is fine, and we can mark this with a green dot as not being a sustainable disadvantage. By the way, the production of 1 square meter cotton, for example, a denim jeanswear, requires more than 1,000 liters of processed water. This is 10 times more than leather, so leather actually is not too bad in comparison to other materials. Let's evaluate the chemicals mentioned earlier. The leather industry fully supports the initiative Roadmap to Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals, well known under the shortcut ZDHC. It is an NGO platform which regulates the kind of used chemicals in the field of textile and leather, as well as the manufacturing condition of those chemicals. ZDHC has generated a white list for sustainable chemicals, which are commercially available and fulfill a so-called manufacturing restricted substances list. This MRSL gets frequently updated based on latest science. It can be stated a tannery which chooses to use this chemical portfolio operates safe and responsible. And since the right choice of chemicals in the leather industry is well under control, I mark this field with a green dot as well. What about the sustainability compliance to the leather making process? I think this we can keep pretty short as well. Very simple. Today, in nearly all industrialized operating tanneries, there is a best available process technology in place, which is safe, responsible, and environmental friendly. This is state of the art. And in order to guarantee compliance with this state of the art, the leather industry, together with some brands and suppliers, has established already 13 years ago the so-called Leather Working Group. Core document of the LWG is an auditing protocol to ensure that all these best available technology standards are in place and in use. So it is fair to state if a brand or an OEM source a leather in an LWG rated tannery or a tannery with a similar technical performance standard, it can be ensured that process conditions are fully sustainable. Of course, even the use of the ZDHC whitelist chemicals are part of the protocol. I have to say, there are not too many other industries I know of which offer voluntary their own auditing systems like the leather industry does with ZDHC and LWG to ensure fully environmental compliance and transparency in its entire supply chain. In this perspective, the leather industry, I believe, is much advanced to many other industries, so it is absolutely fair to make even the process section again with a green dot. I believe it would be important that similar restrictions and regulations even should be in place for synthetic materials, for example, such as PVC. Why? PVC, the basic layer for many artificial leather materials, has a high chlorine content. Therefore, it has a potential to create toxic pollution in the form of dioxins. In addition, exposure to PVC often includes exposure to phthalates, which may have serious health effects as well. In the leather industry, phthalates are completely banned already since many years, and of course, not part of the ZDHC whitelist of chemicals. Coming now to another important and serious sustainability aspect of leather production. It is the management of byproducts. The production of 1 kg of leather generates on a dry substance base about 2 to 3 kg of byproducts. This is a lot and could lead to a serious potential waste problem. However, those byproducts are mostly proteins and therefore not waste, so a valuable raw material source for many other articles. I talk about the fat, the lime splits, shavings, etc. generated during the process, as well as the trimming parts, leather scraps generated in the cutting steps. All can be used for many applications. Therefore, the tanneries, together with the chemical industry, are working on many concepts to make use of the byproducts in other downstream processes as much as possible. And because those activities are in place in a modern tannery, by the way, even this is part of the LWG audit, it is not a sustainable disadvantage, and we can mark this again with a green dot. Next, I want to make another point clear, which often is taken to the disadvantage of leather, the product carbon footprint. To provide some additional scientific facts here, I'm going to refer to a benchmark study of different upholstery materials done by Jutta Knödler, shown on the left, as well as the latest environmental footprint category rules for leather published in 2018 by the EU after an extensive scientific pilot study together with the meat industry. The benchmark study from Knödler has compared in a cradle-to-grave process the product carbon footprint for the entire lifespan of an automotive seat material. You see here from left to right, including the production of chemicals, transportation of intermediates, wastewater treatments, the use in the car during its lifetime, as well as the final disposal of the seat material in an incineration. As a result of a detailed step-by-step analysis, it can be shown that the carbon footprint of PVC or PU-coated material is around 16 kg, the PCF of a cotton material is about 19, and from a polyester type of woven material, 21 kg per CO2 equivalents per square meter. So, how does it compare with leather? Even here, all steps have been evaluated separately. The chemical production, the transportation of hides and wet blues, the tannery operation itself, the wastewater treatment, the use in the car. With 8.1 kg, the same value has been taken as for the other materials. And finally, the incineration, which in the opposite to the synthetics, for leather gives a slightly positive contribution because it is based on a renewable material source. All in all, we come to a similar value of 17.2 kg, just evaluating the leather making process. An open question very often remains, how big is this PCF allocation from the farming of animals? What are the appropriate boundaries of the footprint calculation? This exactly was part of the scientific study of the European Union mentioned before. Result I have put in this flowchart. According to this new EU norm, 88% of the CO2 footprint of a cow is allocated to the milk and dairy industry, and only 12% is allocated to the meat, to the body. From the 12% of the body, 96.5% are allocated to meat and only 3% to the hide, the basic material for the leather industry. This corresponds to the new EU norm of 0.42% of the entire farming industry. If we consider then on top an upcycling of byproducts, as mentioned before, and follow the logic of allocation based on weight, further 70% of this footprint can be allocated out to the upcycled byproducts, and only 30% of it finally remains with genuine leather articles. This means only 0.14% of the entire carbon footprint of a cow has to be allocated to the material leather. This corresponds to an allocation of 3 kg. If we include this in the leather making process, it adds up to a total of 20.2 kg CO2 equivalents per square meter of leather. This is in the same order of magnitude as the other materials. Therefore, I have set even this parameter with a green dot as well. Leather is as good as bad than the other materials. Finally, I want to come to a real advantage of the material leather compared to synthetics, an aspect which in today's sustainability mindset gets more and more important, the biodegradability of a material. Before I explain it in a bit more detail, it is important in this discussion to point out the difference between two aspects, which often get mixed up. On one hand, a bio-based origin of a raw material, which means its origin is renewable and it is generated by a biological process in nature. And on the other hand, the term biodegradability. This is a natural process when a material in a reasonable time frame, let's say about 100 days, breaks down into components which can be taken up by biocycles again. It gets demineralized. Based on this, we can differentiate 4 coordinate sections as shown in the scheme on the right side. First, left bottom, there are synthetic polymers, which on one hand are based on fossil source, oil, and on the other hand, not biodegradable. These are plastics such as PVC, polyester, or polyolefins. Then the chemical industry is in process to develop more and more special plastics which can biodegrade based on caprolactam, succinates, or something like this. However, they are still based on oil. The third group contains bio-based plastics. They are based on natural sources such as cellulose or generated by an enzyme, but they cannot biodegrade due to its chemical modification. And finally, the group of material covers a true sustainable biopolymer, meaning they are based on a renewable raw material source and can biodegrade as well. This, of course, is the case with the basic material of leather, collagen, as well as with many chemicals used in the leather manufacturing process, like wedge tans, lecithin oils, or so. Based on this scientific categorization, a clear differentiation can be done between artificial leather, standard plastic, which is 100% based on oil and not biodegradable at all, and on the other hand, genuine leather, which consists mainly on renewable raw materials and biodegrades in the environment in a short period of time. Here I have to add, currently about 70 to 90% of a material leather, depending on the thickness and the recipe, is biodegradable. Theoretically possible is even a value of 100%, and the industry is working on chemicals and recipes to bring this value up as high as possible, of course. However, this needs to be done together with the brands and the OEMs, because it always goes to the disadvantage of some technical performance of leather. And this has to be evaluated, but from a sustainability point of view, this makes sense, of course, and should be the target. To complete this last parameter in the process chart, we can state, other than synthetic materials, leather is, even from the aspect of biodegradability, a sustainable material and can be marked in this parameter also with a green dot. My last slide. Let me summarize my leather story. I hope I was clear in my argumentation, saying leather can be sourced from a safe and audited production process. Leather chemistry is proven to be safe in use and harmless for environment and human health. And the leather material is based mainly on renewable materials, which are fully biodegradable. As a conclusion, I think it is fair to state that the leather industry has successfully managed the process of change from an old handcraft to a modern recycling industry. In terms of sustainability readiness level and transparency in their supply chain, I think the leather industry is not only better than their image, but far beyond from many other industries. Due to the 3 important facts. First, that the leather industry has no impact or 0 influence on any problematic downstream processes, such as deforestation or unacceptable farming conditions. And second, as mentioned, that the standard leather making process is safe and a sustainable operation. And third, that leather in its final use normally replaces the application of a fossil-based synthetic material. Based on these three facts, I think we can conclude the use of leather is the ultimate sustainable choice of a material. Thanks for your attention.
Dietrich, thank you so much. And again, it's very, very unbelievable as to what occurs in the transformation of a natural hide into a beautiful leather article and the involvement of chemistry in that entire process. It's a wonderful story, very, very unique from a product information standpoint. And now, finally, Egbert Dikkers will wrap up our webinar today and provide a presentation on leather fits perfectly in the circular economy. Egbert, please take it away. We appreciate it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. On behalf of Leather Naturally, I kindly welcome you in this webinar organized by GST. My name is Egbert Dikkers. I am active in the leather industry for 28 years and working as Global Director Sustainability for Smit & Zoon, a company developing and marketing leather chemicals. I am chairing Leather Naturally, which is a industry member association that focuses on education and promotion of leather. There is a lot of debate about the role of leather in society, including a lot of misunderstanding. In this presentation, I want to stress that leather fits perfectly in the circular economy. Leather has a long history and it is still a cool material today. Leather was already used by the Egyptians approximately 5,000 years ago. And if you think about it, the Egyptians might have been one of the first societies understanding their ethical duty that byproducts from their hunting for food had to be turned into valuable products, bringing protection and joy in their lives. Still today, leather is made from a byproduct from the meat, dairy and wool industry, bringing luxury and longevity to global society. As was mentioned by Steve Sothmann before, we all have an ethical duty to use byproducts from other industries. In our case, this means that the leather industry is adding to a circular economy by using a byproduct from the meat, dairy and wool industry and turning it into versatile, long-lasting products. To me, it is sometimes frustrating to hear that up to 60% of young generations thinks that the cow is killed for leather. We all know this is nonsense and that no single cow is killed for leather. But it is up to the industry and to responsible brands to be transparent about the origin of a product and communicate the value of leather in a modern society. When you Google leather or tannery on the internet, you will find horrible pictures that some groups want consumers and you to believe that that is representing the industry and how leather is made. Yes, it's true that just like in any industry, also in the leather industry, there are still people that manufacture leather in a way that should be forbidden. However, every day, passionate leather manufacturers all over the world manufacture leather in a responsible way with traceable processes and respect for people and the environment. The pictures on this slide represent how modern leather manufacturers make leather. Luckily, the last decade has shown a strong development of initiatives driven by the brands and the industry itself to monitor manufacturing processes. The Leather Working Group, which is mostly seen as the industry benchmark, the iCheck and CSCB are three initiatives that are supporting leather manufacturers to control their processes through an audited approach. Increasingly, hides and skins can be traced back to the slaughterhouse, and in the case of bovine hides, also increasingly traced back to the farmer. In chemicals, the ZDHC Foundation is a leading initiative from the brands to tightly control the usage of the right chemicals in the manufacturing of textile and leather, preventing the use of hazardous substances. Brands can drive change. Responsible brands drive change and use the available facts to make the right decisions in deciding which material to use and how to communicate about it in our value chain. It is therefore that you are kindly invited to invest time in understanding leather and its value in society. You can already drive change by buying leather from certified leather manufacturers and requiring them to only use chemicals that are in line with the ZDHC manufacturer restricted substance list. At last but not least, you can drive change by educating the consumer about the sustainability and the value of leather in a modern society. You are kindly invited to consult the Leather Naturally website to support you in searching for the facts on leather or get in touch with our communications team. I want to share my personal experience when I got my new leasing car in January last year. Working in sustainability for a chemical company in the leather industry, I wanted to have an electrical car with, you can imagine, leather seating. On the brochure and the order confirmation, it was confirmed that the car was ordered like this. When I entered the car dealer to pick up my car, the car was wrapped under a red carpet, and when I took it off and opened the front door, and immediately noticed something strange in the seats. So I asked the dealer, why did you put in plastic instead of leather, which I ordered? Much to my surprise, the car dealer said, but sir, this is leather. This is synthetic leather. Well, I thought I exploded, thinking why from all people this happens to me. In the meantime, I discovered that many consumers feel misled as well, so I'm not the only one. I decided to not start a discussion with the individual person from the car dealer, as his knowledge seemed to lack a thorough material training. Instead, I got in touch with the leasing company, the car dealer, and the car brand. It was only the local car dealer and the leasing company that supported me in my claim, took me serious, and replaced the plastic for leather. The car brand did not take any responsibility and simply referred to the disclaimer and said they adjusted their brochure in the meantime. For me personally, I'm happy that my colleagues are now allowing me back on the parking after I had the plastic seats removed. But seriously, you might imagine that I will never buy any product from this brand again, taking in mind they seem to prefer margin over taking their customers serious or even care for consumer satisfaction. I share this story because brands have an ethical duty to label their products correctly and thus take consumers serious. You should also realize that there is a great sustainable story to be told about leather that increases customer and consumer satisfaction and your car sales. Based on my personal story, Leather Naturally created an infographic explaining what the frequently used labels actually mean. The names on this slide mostly refer to artificial oil-based materials. One that is missing but frequently used in Italy is eco-leather. You increasingly see company initiatives where plant-based materials are included in the end materials, mostly combined with oil-based materials to increase the strength of the desired materials. I want to be straight that the leather industry is not against any new and innovative material. We do have a problem when alternatives try to benefit from the good image of leather and use label combinations that are misleading brands and consumers and damage the image of leather. Some brands use contradictional labels like vegan leather. Leather is made from an animal, and as such, any relation to vegan is a contradiction by itself. Including the word vegan does seem to increase margin in many cases, but only refers to a material that is not originating from animals. What most brands do not tell is that the alternative material is mostly oil-based. It's questionable if consumers would opt for vegan leather labeled products if they would know that is mostly derived from oil. One could even debate why a vegetarian would not be able to consume leather. As long as people eat meat, hides and skins will become available, and we have a choice to either put it on landfill or create a long-lasting material out of it. Vegetarians still can make sustainable choices by not eating meat and at the same time consume leather instead of alternatives often derived from oil. The usage of leather in material labeling may only refer to a material from a hide and skin when it's with its original fibrous structure more or less intact, tend to be imperturbable, and where the hair or wool may or may not have been removed. The full information sheet can be downloaded at leathernaturally.org. The term leather is protected in various countries by strict laws and regulations, supporting consumers in understanding what they buy. Leather is a unique material used in fashion, outdoor, furniture and transportation interiors. Leather is sustainable, it's luxurious, it's strong, it's durable, it's easy to clean, it brings comfort, it is repairable, and it brings longevity. Did you know that various airlines use leather seating in their planes because they can simply be cleaned with a damp cloth compared to textile seats that need to be dry cleaned and be re-fireproofed every 6 months? I know about airlines that have their seats in short haul tracks replaced after 10 to 12 years, with the leather still used to make leather goods. This is a big difference compared to textile seats that are said to last 3 to 5 years. With the changing automotive industry, with, for example, car sharing and more intense use, leather is the perfect material, using less raw materials and extended usage. Concluding, leather fits perfectly in the circular economy and in a modern society. Leather offers a historic heritage and it is still a cool material today. Leather is a good alternative for a huge pile of wasted hides and skins. Leather is largely manufactured under tight auditing programs, and leather has a story to be shared with consumers with pride. Leather has unique material characteristics compared to alternatives. For more information about leather, you are kindly invited to visit the Leather Naturally website, follow our social media, or be inspired about leather on the Matcha platform, where creative minds from Generation Z and millennials come together to be inspired about leather. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward in supporting you in proudly communicating about leather with your customers. Thank you very much.